Hello and welcome back to The Walking Dead Retrospective, where today we'll be starting the next major arc in the series, The Long Road to Washington, D.C. This one is another instance of the stories continuing to diverge in both character-centric and in a overall narrative sense. And with this one in particular, if you haven't read the books yourself, you're in for quite a few surprises. But with that, let us get straight into it. Okay, yes, I lied. There are still a couple more things that I want to mention just before we get to the story. And that is the promotional material for the latter half of this season. Firstly, I want to mention the poster with the signature line, "Don't look back." Not much else to say here, aside from the fact that the whole following the railroads vibe is absolutely classic Apocalypse and something that surprisingly we have not really seen a lot of in the books. And somewhat connected to this, we also get a trailer that for some reason I cannot find anymore, but alright, that's not entirely important. What is important is the cover of Bad Moon Rising by Mournful Rituals. If you've only ever heard the original upbeat version of the song, this one might be a tad surprising, but oh boy, do I love the much darker tone of it. It perfectly fits into the series. So yes, as usual, I really recommend giving it a listen. But with that said, now let us actually get into the story. Season 4B in particular is quite difficult to tackle, as is the perfect example of how the TV version remixed quite a few of the storylines in question and removed others outright. In many ways, it's almost like Season 1, in that it began very similarly, but by the end looked drastically different. On top of that, there's also a fundamental difference in how the stories are told, in that their goals are completely different. In the comic, it's all about reaching Washington, whereas in the adaptation, that does not come into play until mid-season 5, and is instead simply to regroup. But that will become clearer the further we get into the story. Both versions open with Michonne returning to the prison to put down the zombified versions of Herschel in the TV version, and Tyrese in the comic book, and later following the track left behind by some of the survivors. Though do note that even this carries a much different weight than it does in the TV version. Sure, Herschel was a good friend to her and an all-around cool guy, but Tyrese was her romantic partner. So while the event is essentially identical in the two versions, the comic book version is a lot more personal to her. We then cut to Rick and Carl, who are searching for supplies and a place to lay low for a while. And this marks the first major difference. In the book, for the most part, Rick appears to be fine, and problems only appear shortly after they find a house to settle down in for a while. If you recall, Rick got shot in one of the governor's attacks, and this wound gets severely infected. The house they find does indeed have antibiotics, but Rick is still out of commission for a while. More on this in a second. In the adaptation, on the other hand, Rick's appearance should be a pretty good indicator of how he's doing. His leg was shot and likely has an infection, he was beaten to the ground by the governor, and his hand is still messed up from his fight with Tyrese from earlier in the season. Though the result is largely the same. Rick is fading in and out of consciousness for a few days, while Carl has to look after both him as well as himself. And on the note of Carl, I think there are a couple of even more important things to talk about straight away. Firstly, it's how the conflict between him and his father is portrayed. In the adaptation, the governor's attack came completely out of the blue and had very little to do with Rick's decisions. Yet Carl still largely blames him. Of course, this is him dealing with loss in his own way, but it always felt a tad off for me, especially when compared to the books. After the governor's initial attack, some of the group decided to leave, while Rick decided to stay put. And so, whether directly or not, as a result, he lost his mother, his little sister, seemingly his best friend Sophia, among many others. And as such, I think him being quite detached from everything feels a bit more believable than it did in the adaptation. And finally, we have to bring up another very major difference that I also brought up in the previous parts. And that is the difference in Carl's age. Again, this is clearly something that the TV version had absolutely no control over. Chandler Riggs just ages as any human would, so there is a big discrepancy between their age in the two versions. According to the fan-made comic book timeline, only 144 days have passed since the apocalypse began, meaning that Carl is a mere 9 years old. Comparatively, in the adaptation, Chandler Riggs when filming this was 14-15 already. To put that into perspective, in the book, he is still only 13 by the end of the Whisperer arc. And with that said, I do think that this is the season where his comic book counterpart will actually become the more capable, and for me, also the superior version, and it will remain that way for the rest of the series. As much as I think Carl is one of the best characters in the book, I don't think it could have worked with the much older Chandler. It just wouldn't make sense. He's pretty much an adult already, and as such, his story will be written with a much more mature perspective, which we will get into later in the series. But yes, it is pretty much at this point where for me, the comic book version of Carl just becomes hands down the best version. With that said, in both versions, Carl has to lead the walkers away from the house in which Rick is still unconscious. And again, this scene should be a good indicator of how young Carl is in the books. I mean, look at him. He's absolutely tiny. In the adaptation, on the other hand, this is where a legendary meme is born. Carl eating the massive tub of chocolate pudding. Say what you will about his character in the TV version, but this scene is perfect and is indeed exclusive to the adaptation. Once Carl returns to the house, in both versions we get the iconic scene of him yelling at the unconscious Rick about how he got many of their group killed. And again, due to the difference in circumstances, I think it works much better in the books, as you could argue that it was indeed Rick's decision to stay there that resulted in their deaths. And this will play into another aspect which we will talk about in just a little bit. But in a more meta sense, yet another iconic meme was born here. The bad lip-reading video, and more importantly, the Carl Papa song. Yes, this was not the first in their series of bad lip-reading The Walking Dead, but oh boy, did this one in particular go viral. They're sitting at a combined 50 million views right now, so I'm willing to bet that many of you will have at least heard of it at some point. But yes, it's worth returning to if you want to look at what 2014 YouTube looked like, and if you just want to have a good laugh. But alright, back to the story. Another sort of minor, but also kind of important change is that in the adaptation, we get a little more of Michonne's backstory. As of right now in the books, we know that she talks to herself, which is something that we also see in the live-action version. Though in addition, we get a flashback/dream sequence to her boyfriend, one of their friends, and their kids. In the comic, on the other hand, much of her backstory is left quite ambiguous. There was a 6-page short released in 2012, simply called the Michonne Special, which did show how she turned her boyfriend and his best friend into her 2 signature protector walkers. And there is also the Telltale series Michonne mini-season delving further into her backstory, but in terms of the comic itself, so far we don't really know much about her. And yes, in case you were wondering, part of the Telltale games are considered as canon. Much of the story in the aforementioned Michonne game does take place far later in the series, but there are quite a few flashbacks which do give us some insights into her life. Though speaking a little more broadly for a second, because this will be important later on, in the adaptation, Michonne had a son, whereas in the books, she had 2 daughters. Again, not exactly important now, but just to avoid confusion later. Returning to the duo of Rick and Carl, in the adaptation, once Rick is somewhat back on his feet, almost immediately we get a surprise knock on the door, revealing that Michonne has indeed found them. In the book, on the other hand, there are still quite a few events to happen before they meet anyone. First off, while they're out searching for supplies, Rick suddenly calls to Carl, telling him to run inside as he had apparently heard a phone ringing. He picks it up and begins to talk to the person on the other side. This is of course not an actual person, but merely Rick dealing with the losses at the prison. But there's also quite a major change in the way this entire thing is portrayed, with the first one being the obvious differences in circumstances, as this happened all the way back in early Season 3. But on top of that, in the adaptation, it was more so frantic desperation from Rick, whereas in the comic, at least personally, they never seemed as intense. They more so seemed as this tragic process of someone actually dealing with loss. Though this is just the first of many conversations on the phone, so for now, just keep this in mind. Another thing to happen during this period of time is where Rick and Carl come across a random survivor that is being overrun by walkers. Carl wants to help him, but Rick tells him to stand down and that he is already gone. In the adaptation, this is moved to much later in Season 4, but I do think it is a very important aspect in shaping Carl's character throughout this arc, which for some reason never really came into play in the adaptation. As I said a little earlier, it's during this arc that, for me at least, Carl in the books finally becomes a much more fleshed out and complex character, starting with the entire sequence of him blaming Rick for everything that happened at the prison, to this instance of Carl being told not to help the survivor, as well as many more things that we're yet to get to. And, as you'd expect, all of this will culminate in Carl becoming very brutal. An aspect that, again, never really happens in the adaptation, despite a lot of the same moments still being adapted. Returning to the house, Rick continues to talk on the phone until he finally asks who he is actually talking to, only for the person to respond, "Rick, it's me. It's Lori." And then there's this brilliant moment of realization as he follows the cable, only to see it unplugged. He proceeds to tell Carl that they are moving on right away, but before leaving, puts the phone in his bag. Again, personally, I prefer how the comic handled the entire phone conversation thing. While I do think that his initial reactions to losing Lori in the TV version were absolutely perfect, the following episodes of him stumbling around in a sort of a daze were a bit hit and miss for me. Yes, you can of course argue that that is realistic, but that's not entirely the point here. Though returning to the book, following this we get a quite comedic scene as Rick is trying to teach Carl to drive, where we see the obligatory father-son driving experience of the both of them yelling at each other and it generally not being a great time. Again, due to Chandler being much older, I think that comedic factor would have been lost here, as a phrase like "I can't reach the pedal" just doesn't work. Though following this little comedic moment, we snap right back to reality, as Carl is very nearly bitten by a walker, only to be saved by Michonne in the nick of time. And there is also this super wholesome moment as he jumps to hug her, as again, to them, every single person they knew from the prison was pretty much dead. So currently, in both versions, they've reunited with Michonne, though in the TV adaptation, this of course still happens back at the house. And before they leave, a few more major things happen. But before we even get to those, there's still a fundamental difference in how these stories are told. In the source material, we never leave Rick. As of right now, the only other people we know are alive is Carl and Michonne. Whereas in the adaptation, episode 410 gives us an insight into pretty much where everyone is. So again, much of the surprise factor that existed in the books is removed by default. In the TV version, Michonne and Carl go out on a supply run while Rick is still resting back at the house. That is, until he is woken up by a noise downstairs. And so, we are introduced to Joe and the Claimers. Broadly speaking, this group is exclusive to the adaptation, but some of what they'll get into is very similar to the books, the Marauders to be more precise. But we'll talk about that, as well as just more about the Claimers as a whole in a little bit. Rick's first interaction with them is of course not the greatest, as he strangles one of them and runs off with his gun. Admittedly, this entire sequence is a tad bit hard to believe, as the dude he fights never yells out or anything, but fair enough I guess. Though this is the moment where Rick acquires the infamous murder jacket. In case you haven't been around the community and don't know what said jacket is, fret not, as the reason for the name will become clear very soon. It really became a massive meme of sorts among viewers, so we'll be talking plenty about the importance of it later down the line. Oh, and there's an incredibly important detail here that we need to discuss. You know the scene where Rick is hanging off of the side of the roof? Well, according to Andrew Lincoln, the hardest part about shooting that scene was the fact that Norman Reedus, the actor who plays Daryl, was mooning him the entire time. I told you it was important. Jokes aside, following this, Rick, Carl, and Michonne get out of Dodge and begin to follow the train tracks until they see a sign for Terminus claiming to be a sanctuary. And it's here where the rest of the season will massively diverge from the comic book version. Firstly, because Terminus is entirely exclusive to the adaptation, but secondly, because the rest of the season is only focused on the scattered groups finding their way there. And as such, even the character-centric stories will be largely remixed due to this major shift. Jumping ahead for a moment, following this point, Rick would only meet the rest of the group in the season finale. While comparatively, in the source material, almost immediately after Michonne finds Rick and Carl, a couple of people riding horses appear who are revealed to be Glenn and Maggie. They then inform them that quite a few of the members of the group return to the farm. Yes, that being Herschel's farm. Remember that in the books, it wasn't left as a result of walkers or the barn burning down or anything. They just found the prison, a better place to stay. And once they get back to the farm, we see that everyone who survived the attack is already there, and that's the end of them finding each other in the book. In the adaptation, on the other hand, after we've had our check-in with Rick, we see all the scattered groups. The duo of Daryl and Beth, Tyrese, who we find out had indeed saved Judith, Lizzie, Mika, and shortly after Carol. Then there's Sasha, Bob, and Maggie. And last but not least, Glenn, who has just woken up within the prison. And the Glenn waking up part is of course a fairly major change for the adaptation, since after the survivors leave, we never see the prison again in the books. Whereas in the adaptation, Glenn wakes up, comes across Tara, and then they team up. And a few more generic things to mention here that will become more important later on. Maggie takes Herschel's and Billy's deaths a lot harder than she does in the adaptation, where she still has Beth and a clear mission of finding Glenn. In the comic, on the other hand, despite having Glenn right there with her, and being the adoptive mother of Sophia, she's not doing too well. More on this later. And similarly, Glenn having this mission of finding Maggie also gives him much more of a centric role, and for me personally, perfectly demonstrates just how much more likable the TV version of his character was. But with that said, let us move forward. In the books, once they arrive at the farm, we of course see all the characters reunite, but what's important, and you may forget if you haven't read the books yourself, is how close Sophia is with Carl. And here, we see that after all the trauma she has gone through, she tells Carl that Maggie is her only and true mother, making him confused as to if she has forgotten about Carol. A lot of this is just setting up much later plot lines, so for now, just keep that in mind. Cutting to Rick, we see that similar to the adaptation in early season 4, he completely gives up all form of leadership, even catching Dale off guard as he straight up asks what he thinks they should do. This is one of those small things that you don't really notice until it happens. Obviously, Rick has debated about what they should do, etc., but here he is making it clear that he will follow him and not make any decisions himself. He even says outright that if that's what Dale thinks they should do, he will follow him. Again, for me, I think this entire thing worked much better in the books considering what happened in the prison. Yes, the whole Farmer Rick thing worked as he was overcoming the trauma of losing Lori, but here it's much bigger, and as such, I think it carries quite a bit more weight. And final small note before we move on, is Rick going to talk to Michonne about how he carries around the phone on which he talks to Lori, and her responding by saying that she also talks to herself like that. This too, of course, was moved to Season 3 when they went to see Morgan. So yes, they do still have that honest dynamic, but it's just a little bit remixed. As for the adaptation, while Glenn and Tara are getting further away from the prison, Glenn is still not fully recovered from the whole illness we saw in the first half of the season, and as such, all the way through he is a tad bit loopy. And it's just as Glenn falls unconscious that the legendary trio of Abe, Mullet, and Rosita make an appearance. Keep in mind that Glenn's goal right now is to find Maggie, so him being taken further away from where she might be is certainly not in his best interest. And as such, he immediately begins butting heads with Abraham. And, as you might expect, this is by default massively different from the books, as Glenn is back at the farm. Speaking of which, let's tackle their first appearance in the books. In the middle of the night, the group is woken by Andrea firing a warning shot at the trio who had just pulled up to the farm. And straight away we get what in the comic book were major bombshells. First off, and this will probably come as a surprise to many of you, this is the first formal acknowledgement of herds. We had of course seen groups of walkers in the comic before, but nothing on the level of the Atlanta horde in the TV version, or the one in early season 4, which was just massive. The concept of actual herds was still not known in the comic, and it's Eugene that explains this concept here. And this is just an aspect that I think the TV show dropped due to it being good spectacle of just having thousands of walkers on screen. Especially back in season 1 when they were trying to get the viewers' attention, so having these massive hordes was just to get in the headlines. But the other, and this is perhaps even more important, is that Eugene reveals that he knows what caused the apocalypse. For context, remember that in the comic book, the survivors never go to the CDC, and literally everything they know about the zombies is purely through their own experience. On top of that, just like we talked about with the governor, the surprise factor of such a claim was by default magnitudes bigger in the comic book, as we had absolutely no inkling of where the story would go. And I suppose this is a good question to pass on to you, especially the TV-only people. When this quote-unquote cure idea is revealed in the show, how many of you actually believed it? And to those who read the comic before the reveal was actually made, did you believe it even for a second? For obvious reasons, I can't really say which portrayal was more believable to myself, as I just knew because of the source material, but I am genuinely curious. Though additionally, notice Andrea in this situation. Similar to the battle at the prison, where she almost single-handedly picked off most of the governor's forces, here too she is the first to step up. And as we get further into the series, even if you have not read the books yourself, as we talked about in the Season 3 video, you will understand why most people consider her death in the TV version as an absolute character assassination. Because the group is almost always smaller in the books, more often than not, she is at the forefront and will only become more important of a character as time goes on. But speaking a little more broadly, as I said before, this is where essentially the next major arc of the comic book begins. Abraham tells them that sooner or later a horde will pass through here, and that they should be doing everything just to get Eugene to Washington. Comparatively, in the TV adaptation, that is only ever told to Glenn and Tara. And on top of that, since they have very much conflicting interests, the entire start of their relationship is quite a bit rockier. Though before we move any further, I will say it right now, Abraham in the books is very cool, but Michael Cudlitz massively elevated the character for me. Largely due to the same reasons as Steve and Yoon. They both just carry a ton of fun factor. And yes, there is the differences in mediums as we see small details like him laughing and smiling as he fights off walkers, etc. just all make the character a ton of fun to see. And might I say, he almost feels more comic booky in the TV version, and yes, I know that sounds very weird. But we will be talking about Abe a lot more later, as he will be playing a fairly crucial role in just a little bit. After their initial exchange, they just decide to chill out for a day or two while debating on what to do. But in short, small groups of walkers start finding their way to the farm, at the sight of which Abraham, in his signature colorful language, says that he hates being right and that a horde is likely on their way, which immediately pushes everyone to seriously consider going with them, as again, to them the cure idea is still believable. And a small cool detail here is that the shot of Rick and Herschel is sort of replicated here as Rick and Dale are talking. I might be reading into this way too much, but I think there's some pretty cool contrast here between Rick clearly acting as the leader and trying to convince Herschel to let them stay, and here him having lost all confidence and straight up asking Dale what he should do. But yes, shortly after, the group packs up and agrees to follow Abraham in the mission to Washington. Though just before Rick and Carl get into the car, Rick calls him aside and tells him that he should keep an eye on these people. But more importantly, he delivers the very iconic speech that no matter what anyone says and no matter what he thinks, he is not safe. This exact speech does appear later in Season 5, but based on the events that would transpire very shortly, I do have to say that I think it carries a lot more weight in the comic book than it ever did in the adaptation in my opinion. Returning to the TV version, we arrive at what may just be the most controversial episode in the entire series. That being 412 Still. This is what I view as the first full-on bottle episode that we see in the series, and if you're unfamiliar with the term, a bottle episode is pretty much any episode that is produced with a very tight budget and small in scope. As such, we only ever see the duo of Daryl and Beth, and there are no big set pieces or anything like that. For the most part, it's just them trying to figure out what to do moving forward. But yes, if you go right now, get a dictionary, and look up the word filler, this is the definition of it. Though, depending on who you ask, this is either the worst episode ever, and you'll get jokes like, episode still where the story stood still, or on the complete opposite sides, it may just be the person's favorite episode. And honestly, I think the reasoning for both sides is actually pretty clear. For many people, this episode just added absolutely nothing of value and can exclusively be written down to, as we've talked about in previous parts, AMC's very stingy budgets. On the flip side, if you love the characters of Beth and Daryl, this is very much a character-centric episode where the both of them get quite a bit of development. I myself am not the biggest fan of this episode by any stretch of the imagination, and not even because of the filler nature of it. Rather, it's the very obvious fact that the only reason why this episode as it is exists is the budget. The same exact story could have taken place, but it could have been spliced in with other stories we know are going on in parallel. But that would mean that the actors technically appear in more episodes, and as such have to be paid more. So, the best course of action is a bottle episode. But on top of all of that, the narrative told here is not terribly exciting either. And when you contrast it to another full-on bottle episode, let's say 414 The Grove, which we will talk about in just a little bit, it's clear that there are much better ways to tell such a story. And unfortunately, this is merely the start of these sorts of limitations due to the budgets. And when you compare this episode to pretty much any that came before, it's almost like the show was declining instead of rapidly growing. Keep in mind, the show still has not peaked in terms of numbers. It is still actively breaking records. But alright, that's the budgeting talk done for today. And despite the very mixed reception of this episode, there are a few things that you might actually find interesting. First off, and this is obviously not some conspiracy and just so happened to play out that way, Beth, in an almost throwaway fashion, tells Daryl that he will be the last man standing. Well, Considering what the cast looks like right now, and the fact that we know him and Carol are getting their own spin-off, she does appear to be right. But secondly, and this is quite a bit more fun, we get yet another hint that The Walking Dead and Breaking Bad actually share a universe. Just in case you weren't aware, the both of them are produced by the same network, that being AMC. And for one reason or another, there have been many common things between the two. There's Glenn's car back in Season 1, which is the same one Walter bought for Walt Jr., though honestly, I don't think that was actually supposed to be an Easter egg of any kind, and I think it was just reusing assets. But hey, it's cool. Then later in Season 2, you can see Heisenberg's signature blue sky when Daryl is looking for meds on the highway. Then there's just some dude named Heisenberg in Woodbury, and no, that is not actually Walter White. And here, Daryl describes this dealer, which very much sounds like Jesse, even down to the phrasing he uses. Obviously, this doesn't hold any meaning outside of just being a fun theory for the fans, but I think it's just cool to talk about regardless. And one last thing we will talk about in the TV adaptation, as this video has already gone way longer than I could have ever expected, is the difference you can see in Maggie's character straight away. As we talked about in the books, she didn't take the deaths of Herschel and Billy too well, which I know I've said a million times already, will come into play to an even greater extent just a tad bit later. But in contrast, in the adaptation, the fact that she does not find Glenn on the bus that had escaped the prison, while obviously hurting, only gives her more determination to find him, even with Sasha and Bob telling her that the odds that he is still alive are extremely slim. And in a broader sense, this is another thing that is quite remixed for the adaptation. This butting of heads about what's best for the group does happen to some extent in the books, but it's a little bit later, and since all of them are already together, it's quite a bit different. In the adaptation, on the other hand, these decisions come down to the individual or pairs of characters. Think Glenn and Tara and Abe's group, Maggie, Sasha, and Bob here, as well as the others. I don't think there's really a way to tell which approach worked better because they are just so different, so I do think it pretty much comes down to preference. Also, you might have noticed just how many more characters there are in the adaptation. Entire groups right now are made of characters who straight up don't exist in the book or are no longer around, and as such, this sort of split up narrative wouldn't really work. And the very last thing to mention here is that the TV show, due to what is a comparatively small change, begins to fall in a cyclic story trap that the comic never did. When you ask people why they stopped watching at some point in the series, a common explanation you'll get is that it just became the survivors finding a new home, it being destroyed, them then stumbling through the forest, finding a new home, rinse and repeat. Obviously that is an oversimplification, but in many ways that is indeed what happens throughout much of the earlier seasons. In the comics, on the other hand, the only location that was actually destroyed so far was the prison. The rest were left behind for different circumstances, and on top of that, we see that previous locations are not forgotten, such as the farm. Yes, I know most people were absolutely sick of the farm by the end of Season 2, but that's just an example. What I'm trying to say here is that the comic books simply had more variety in the reasoning why characters moved locations than we saw in the TV adaptation. And the very existence of Terminus just makes that further pronounced, though more on this in the next part. But to quickly sum up where we currently stand, in the books, what's left of the group have all joined up with Abraham, Eugene, and Rosita and are on their way to Washington, D.C. So comparatively, this arc begins much sooner than it does in the TV version. Meanwhile, in the adaptation, most of the smaller groups have now seen the Terminus signs and are on their way to what they believe to be Sanctuary. Though the big difference here is that no one aside from Glenn and Tara have met Abraham yet. We also don't yet have any character deaths in either version, so for now, their respective casts remain unchanged. And yes, originally we were supposed to go all the way to the end of the season, but these versions are simply way too different and have way too much to talk about. So with that, next time we will continue our way to Washington DC, as well as look at how the TV version managed to massively remix two separate groups and create a sort of a sub-arc with Terminus. And that's the video. Sheesh, did this one turn out to be massive, and as usual, my voice is gone. Though as always, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these 30+ minute projects. Seriously, thank you. And speaking of which, let us give a warm welcomes to the newest member of the team, Musa Hassan. I am so sorry if I butchered your name. But if you wish to join the highly coveted Mystery Shack Insiders Club, you can do so for as little as $1 per month. And last but not least, let us do the usual secret phrase to see how many of you stuck around until the very end. Leave a comment, whatever it may be, and include the words, Happy Holidays. And yes, that is also my message to all of you, all festive vibes here. If you enjoyed the video, please share it and do all the YouTube things to let the algorithm know. But now, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.